In the harsh, unforgiving badlands of Arizona Territory, 1878, a man with trembling hands rode into the dusty settlement of Copper Ridge. Thomas Markham, age 35, appeared to most as just another down-on-his-luck drifter, nervous, possibly sickly, and definitely out of place. His hands shook when he lifted his canteen, trembled when he signed the hotel register, and quivered noticeably when he strapped on his worn gun belt. The locals marked him immediately as prey, not predator. In a land where such distinctions meant life or death, what no one in Copper Ridge realized was that Thomas Markham's trembling hands concealed a deadly secret. Behind those shaking fingers lay the lightning-fast reflexes of a man who had once been the most feared manhunter west of the Mississippi. A man whose name had been whispered with dread from Texas to Montana. A man who had spent the last 3 years trying desperately to disappear. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The relentless summer sun beat down on Thomas Markham's shoulders as he guided his chestnut mare down Copper Ridge's main street. The settlement was larger than he'd expected. A dozen or so permanent structures lined the rutted dirt road, including a general store, a saloon aptly named The Last Drop, and a 2-story hotel that had seen better days. The distinctive clanging of a blacksmith's hammer rang out from the far end of town, punctuating the otherwise heavy afternoon quiet. Thomas hunched lower in his saddle, an unconscious habit from years of trying to avoid notice. His once fine black hat was pulled low over his eyes, the brim frayed and sweat-stained. His coat, despite the heat, remained buttoned to conceal the Remington revolver holstered at his hip. 3 years of running had taught him that weapons drew attention, but a man without one drew predators. As he passed the saloon, Thomas felt the weight of eyes tracking his movement. 3 men lounged on the porch, whiskey glasses in hand despite the early hour. Their expressions shifted from boredom to interest as they observed his approach, noted his good horse, his threadbare but quality clothing, and most tellingly, the visible tremor in his hands as he adjusted his reins. "Looks like we got ourselves a shaker," one of them commented, voice pitched deliberately to carry. "Nerve disease or whiskey sickness, you reckon?" his companions chuckled. "Either way, he won't last long out here." Thomas kept his gaze forward, ignoring the bait with practiced discipline. Copper Ridge wasn't his first choice of refuge, but his dwindling funds and the mare's developing limp had made the decision for him. He needed rest, supplies, and if possible, a few days' work to replenish his meager savings before continuing north to Montana Territory. There, perhaps, he might finally find anonymity among the mining camps and newly established ranches, hungry for workers, regardless of their pasts. The hotel, the Copper Star, according to its weather-beaten sign, offered a hitching post out, a front where Thomas carefully dismounted. His legs were stiff from 12 hours in the saddle, and his hands shook more pronouncedly as he secured the mare. He paused, flexing his fingers deliberately, focusing on the familiar exercises he'd developed. To manage the tremors. They were worse today, aggravated by exhaustion and hunger. "Need help with your bags, mister?" The voice startled him, sending his hand instinctively toward his concealed weapon before he registered its source. A boy of perhaps 12 years stood nearby, thin and sunburned, but with bright, evaluating eyes. "No trouble," Thomas replied, forcing his hand away from his coat. "Just this one saddlebag." The trembling was unmistakable as he reached for his belongings, and he saw the boy's eyes track the movement with undisguised curiosity. "You sick, mister?" The directness of the question, absent of mockery, was refreshing after months of whispered comments and sidelong glances. "Not exactly," Thomas answered, surprising himself with his honesty. "It's just something that happens. Been this way for 3 years now." The boy nodded as if this explanation made perfect sense. My granddad's hands shake too. Ma says it's 'cause he saw things in the war nobody should see. Thomas felt an unexpected tightness in his throat. Your ma might be right about that. I'm Billy Rawlins, the boy offered, extending his hand with the solemn formality of youth. Thomas. Markham. He took the small hand carefully, conscious of moderating his grip despite the tremor. You planning to stay long, Mr. Markham? Most folks just pass through, unless they're running from something or looking for something. The astute observation from one so young brought a ghost of a smile to Thomas's weather-lined face. Just long, enough to rest my mare and replenish supplies. She's picked up a stone bruise, I think. Should take her to Mr. Calloway at the livery. He's good with horses. Not so good with people, but horses trust him. I'll do that. Thank you, Billy. The boy lingered, clearly hoping for further conversation, or perhaps a small coin for his helpfulness. But Thomas needed solitude more than information. He nodded a farewell and made his way into the hotel's dim interior. The lobby was sparsely furnished but clean. A counter, 2 mismatched chairs, and a potted plant that was valiantly clinging to life despite the arid climate. Behind the counter, a thin man with spectacles perched on a prominent nose looked up from his ledger. Room for the night? He asked, already reaching for a key from the rack behind him. Maybe longer, Thomas replied, depending on the rates, and if my horse needs more recovery time. The clerk, Harold Wells, according to the name painted on the wall behind him, assessed Thomas with the measuring gaze of a man accustomed to judging a customer's ability to pay. $1 a night, $5 for the week, includes breakfast but not supper. We're not fancy, but we're clean, and we don't ask questions. He pushed the register toward Thomas. Sign here. Thomas nodded, appreciating the implied discretion. He reached for the offered pencil, gripping it with deliberate focus, but the tremor remained evident as he carefully wrote his name. Not his real name. That identity had been buried years ago alongside the last men he'd killed. But Thomas. Markham had become real enough over time. Wells glanced at the shaking signature without comment, though Thomas knew he'd filed the observation away. In small towns like Copper Ridge, knowledge was currency, and a man with trembling hands might be the subject of conversation at tonight's supper tables. Room 8, top of the stairs, end of the hall, Wells said, sliding a key across the counter. Washrooms at the other end. Kitchen serves breakfast from 6 to 8. Much obliged. Thomas pocketed the key, his fingers trembling against the metal. Is there any work to be had in town? Just for a few days. Wells scratched his chin thoughtfully. Livery might need help. The mine closed 6 months back, so most able hands have moved on, left us with the dregs, to be honest. He eyed Thomas's shaking hands dubiously, though you might have trouble finding work with that condition. I manage well enough, Thomas responded, not entirely sure if it was true. He climbed the narrow staircase to the second floor, hyper-aware of the creaking floorboards announcing his progress. Old habits died hard. He automatically counted doors, noted which ones showed light beneath them, identified the window at the end of the hall as a potential exit. Room 8 was small but offered a bed with clean linens, a washstand with a cracked porcelain basin, and most importantly, a window overlooking the rear of the building with a clear view of the stable where his mare would be housed. Thomas set his saddlebag on the bed and withdrew his most valuable possessions, a Remington Model 1875 revolver with custom pearl grips, a box containing 46 cartridges, $78 in mixed currency, and a folded, much-creased letter addressed simply to T in a woman's elegant hand. The tremor in his fingers intensified as he touched the letter, as it always did. He returned it to the saddlebag without opening it. Some wounds never truly healed. They just scarred over enough to function around. After securing the room, wedging a chair beneath the doorknob, and checking that the window opened smoothly, Thomas decided to tend to his mare before seeking a meal. The memory of the men outside. The saloon lingered unpleasantly. Copper Ridge had the feel of a town where trouble could find a man easily, especially one who appeared vulnerable. As he descended the hotel stairs, Thomas caught fragments of conversation from the small parlor, adjacent to the lobby. Bradford gang spotted near Twin Buttes yesterday. Stagecoach carrying payroll next Tuesday. Sheriff Lawson laid up with that bullet still in his shoulder. Thomas slowed his pace, absorbing the information with the habitual attentiveness that had kept him alive through years as a bounty hunter and, before that, a cavalry scout. A town without effective law enforcement, a notorious gang in the vicinity, and an upcoming payroll shipment created a volatile situation that he wanted no part of. Perhaps it would be better to press on after all, despite his mare's condition. The trembling in his hands intensified at the thought, a physical manifestation of the instinct that had saved his life more times than he could count. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Thomas led his chestnut mare down the dusty back street toward the livery stable, his mind churning with the fragments of conversation he'd overheard. The Bradford gang was notorious throughout the territories, 4 brothers and their assorted accomplices who had graduated from cattle rustling to stagecoach robberies and bank heists over the past 5 years. Thomas had crossed paths with them once, back in his former life, tracking them briefly for the reward before a more lucrative bounty had drawn him elsewhere. The livery stable occupied a large, weathered structure at the edge of town. As Thomas approached, the rich scents of hay, horses, and leather brought a comforting familiarity. A broad-shouldered man with a steel-grey beard emerged from the shadowy interior, wiping his hands on a rag tucked into his belt. "Something I can help you with?" he asked, eyeing Thomas and the mare with equal assessment. "This is Sadie," Thomas replied, stroking the mare's neck. "She's developed a limp in her right foreleg. Stone bruise, I suspect. Young Billy Rawlins recommended you." The man's weathered face softened slightly at the mention of the boy. "Billy's got a good eye for folk. I'm Ezekiel Calloway." He approached the mare, running practiced hands down her leg as she stood patiently. "Yep, stone bruise. Not too bad. But she needs rest. 3 days minimum." Thomas nodded, resigning himself to the extended stay. "I'd like to board her with you then, and I'm looking for work if you know of any." Calloway's gaze moved from the mare to Thomas, taking in his trail-worn appearance and inevitably his trembling hands. Unlike most, the stableman's expression showed neither mockery nor pity, just practical evaluation. "Could use some help around here, actually. Previous boy quit to try his luck in the silver fields." He gestured toward the stable. "Pay's modest, $1.50 a day plus a place to sleep in the loft if you prefer it to the hotel." "I'll take it," Thomas said, surprised by the offer. "Fair warning, though, my hands aren't always steady." Calloway shrugged. "Horses don't much care about shaky hands if the heart behind them is calm. You start tomorrow morning, 6 sharp." He began leading the mare toward a stall. "I'll poultice that bruise tonight." "Much obliged." Thomas hesitated, then added, "I heard talk about the Bradford gang nearby. That common knowledge?" Calloway's expression darkened. "Unfortunately, Sheriff Lawson took a bullet trying to run them off last week. Deputies barely old enough to shave, town's vulnerable, and everyone knows it." He shot Thomas a speculative look. "You familiar with the Bradfords?" "Heard stories," Thomas answered carefully. "Best avoided from what I gather." "Damn right." Calloway returned his attention to the mare. "You armed?" Thomas nodded slightly, his coat shifting to reveal the outline of his holstered revolver. "Good. Man alone should be in these parts. Just keep your head down while you're here. Copper Ridge has got enough troubles without adding more." As Thomas made his way back toward the main street, his thoughts were interrupted by a commotion from the direction of the saloon. Raised voices, followed by the crash of breaking glass, drew reluctant attention. His first instinct was to avoid the disturbance. Involvement of any kind risked unwanted scrutiny, but the street offered no cover, and doubling back would look suspicious. He continued forward, keeping to the boardwalk's edge, hoping to slip past whatever trouble was brewing. The scene unfolding outside the Last Drop saloon demolished that hope. 4 men had surrounded a fifth, the latter a slender figure in a dusty black suit who clutched a leather satchel protectively to his chest. Even at a distance, Thomas recognized the trapped man's profession from his attire, a gambling man, likely caught in a dispute over winnings. "Hand it over, card sharp," demanded the largest of the 4, a barrel-chested man with a drooping mustache. "Nobody wins 5 straight hands without cheating." "Gentlemen, I assure you," the gambler replied, his soft southern accent incongruous in the harsh frontier setting, "the cards simply favored me today. Perhaps tomorrow they'll smile upon you instead. We ain't waiting for tomorrow." Another man grabbed for the satchel, but the gambler nimbly sidestepped, backing directly into Thomas's path. The gambler startled, spinning to face this new potential threat. His features registered surprise, a refined face with intelligent eyes that quickly assessed Thomas as neither immediate ally nor enemy. "Apologies, sir," he said smoothly, tipping his hat as if they'd met at a social gathering rather than a brewing street brawl. Thomas had no chance to reply before the barrel-chested man spoke again. "Well now, what's this? Another card sharp?" His bloodshot eyes fixed on Thomas's trembling hands, or just a sickly drifter with the shakes. The cruel observation drew laughter from his companions. Thomas felt the familiar ice forming in his gut, the cold calculation that had once preceded violence. He fought it down. Those days were behind him. The tremors in his hands intensified. With the effort, "I'm just passing through," Thomas said quietly. "This doesn't concern me." "Maybe it should," the mustached man countered, taking a threatening step closer. "You look like you could use some excitement, or some whiskey for them shaky hands." The gambler, surprisingly, stepped between them. "The gentleman is correct. This is between us. No need to involve innocent bystanders." It was a gallant gesture, if foolish. Thomas noticed the man wore no visible weapon, while his adversaries were all armed. The situation was deteriorating rapidly, and Thomas felt the unwelcome stirring of long-buried instincts. His eyes automatically catalogued threats, the barrel-chested leader's revolver in a cross-draw holster. A skinny man with a knife partially concealed in his boot, 2 others with visible gun butts protruding from their belts but poor positioning for quick draws. "I insist," Thomas said, addressing the gambler while keeping his eyes on the barrel-chested man. "Move along." The gambler hesitated, clearly weighing the odds, then nodded slightly. "As you wish. Good day, gentlemen." He attempted to step around the group, but the leader grabbed his arm roughly. "Nobody's going nowhere till I get my money back." "That would be difficult," the gambler replied with remarkable composure, "since it was never your money to begin with." The leader's face flushed with rage. His hand moved toward his holster with drunken clumsiness. "Why, I wouldn't," Thomas said, his voice dropping to a register that stopped the man mid-motion. All eyes turned to him, registering surprise at the transformation. Though his hands still trembled visibly, something in Thomas's stance had changed. The seemingly nervous drifter had vanished, replaced by something dangerous. "This ain't your business, Shaky," the leader growled, but uncertainty had crept into his tone. "I'm making it my business," Thomas replied evenly. "The man won fair. Let him go." "You backing him with them trembling hands?" The skinny man with the boot knife laughed incredulously. "You can barely hold yourself steady, let alone a gun." Thomas didn't respond to the taunt. His eyes, now cold and evaluating, remained fixed on the barrel-chested leader. "Last chance. Walk away." The standoff stretched into uncomfortable silence. Around them, the previously bustling street had emptied as townsfolk sensed trouble brewing. From the hotel doorway, Thomas noticed Harold Wells watching with intense interest. Nearby, young Billy Rawlins peered from beside a rain barrel, eyes wide with fascination. Finally, the leader spat in the dirt near Thomas's boots. "Ain't worth the trouble. This town's got slim pickings anyway." He jabbed a thick finger toward the gambler. "You best clear out before sundown, card sharp. And you," he turned to Thomas, "better hope we don't cross paths again." With that, he gestured to his companions, and the four men shambled back toward the saloon, casting venomous glances over their shoulders. As they disappeared through the bat-wing doors, Thomas exhaled slowly, consciously relaxing the tension coiled within him. The brief confrontation had awakened reflexes he'd worked years to suppress. "I appear to be in your debt, sir," the gambler said, extending a hand. "Elijah Montgomery, at your service." Thomas regarded the offered hand for a moment before accepting it, making no attempt to hide his tremor. "Thomas Markham." "A pleasure, Mr. Markham." Montgomery's handshake was firm, his gaze direct. "May I inquire what brings a man of your particular qualities to Copper Ridge?" "Just passing through," Thomas replied, uncomfortable with the scrutiny. "Indeed." Montgomery adjusted his brocade waistcoat with fastidious precision. "Curious, though, how a man just passing through would risk himself for a stranger." Thomas shrugged. 4 against 1 seemed unfair odds. "And yet," Montgomery observed quietly, "you didn't seem particularly concerned about the odds." His eyes flickered to Thomas's trembling hands, then back to his face. Fascinating contradiction. Before Thomas could respond, Billy Rawlins darted from his hiding place, excitement overriding caution. "That was something, Mr. Markham. The way you stood up to Bert Porter and his bunch. Nobody ever stands up to them." Thomas winced inwardly at the attention. "Nothing happened, Billy. Just words. But they were backing down from you," the boy persisted. "Even with your shaking hands. How'd you do that?" Montgomery smiled slightly. "An excellent question, young man. Perhaps Mr. Markham might join me for dinner this evening and satisfy my own curiosity on the matter?" Thomas recognized the invitation for what it was, a means of discharging a perceived debt, and more problematically, an opportunity for unwelcome questions. Yet something about Montgomery's intelligent eyes suggested he might be a useful source of information about the town and its current dangers. "Perhaps," Thomas conceded reluctantly. "I have business to attend to first." "Splendid. The hotel dining room at 7, then." Montgomery tipped his hat and strode away, moving with the confident grace of a man accustomed to navigating hazardous situations. Billy remained, practically bouncing with excitement. "You gonna tell him about why your hands shake but you ain't afraid?" Thomas regarded the boy solemnly. "Some stories aren't meant for telling, Billy. Is it 'cause of something bad you did? Or something bad that was done to you?" The perceptiveness of the question, delivered with childlike directness, caught Thomas off guard. "Sometimes," he answered quietly. "It's hard to tell the difference." The hotel dining room was half empty when Thomas arrived at 7. The space was modest, 6 tables covered with faded but clean cloths, illuminated by oil lamps that cast warm pools of light against the gathering dusk. Elijah Montgomery had secured a corner table with a clear view of both the entrance and the street-facing windows, a choice that Thomas noted with professional appreciation. "Mr. Markham," Montgomery greeted him, rising slightly. "I feared you might reconsider our engagement." Thomas had indeed considered it. After the confrontation outside the saloon, he'd spent the remainder of the afternoon in his room, cleaning his Remington with hands that refused to be still and debating the wisdom of forming even casual connections in Copper Ridge. In the end, practicality won over caution. Montgomery seemed well-informed, and information was a currency Thomas couldn't afford to reject. "Didn't have other plans," Thomas said, taking the seat opposite Montgomery, positioning himself with his back to the wall. A server approached, a tired-looking woman of indeterminate age, whose quick, assessing glance revealed she'd sized up the unlikely dining companions, and found the tableau curious. "Specials venison stew tonight, gentlemen," she announced. "Got biscuits too, fresh this afternoon." "That sounds delightful," Montgomery replied, with the practiced charm Thomas had observed earlier. "And perhaps a bottle of whatever passes for decent whiskey in this establishment?" The woman smiled despite herself. "Mr. Peterson keeps a bottle of Kentucky bourbon under the counter for special occasions. Costs extra. A worthy investment." "Thank you, ma'am." After she departed, Montgomery turned his attention fully to Thomas, studying him with undisguised interest. "You've caused quite a stir in our little community, Mr. Markham. The trembling stranger who faced down Bert Porter without breaking a sweat. The story has grown with each retelling. I believe the latest version has you disarming all four men simultaneously." Thomas grimaced. "Gossip travels fast." "The lifeblood of frontier towns," Montgomery agreed. "Though in this case, I suspect, the embellishment stems from wishful thinking. Porter and his crew have been terrorizing Copper Ridge since the sheriff took that bullet." "The Bradford gang's work." Montgomery's eyebrows rose slightly. "You're well informed for a newcomer." "Overheard talk at the hotel." "Indeed. Yes, our esteemed lawman attempted to discourage the Bradfords from setting up operations nearby. Poor judgment on his part, going alone to deliver such a message." Montgomery leaned back as the server returned with 2 bowls of stew, a basket of biscuits and a bottle with 2 glasses. He waited until she withdrew before continuing. "The town's been effectively lawless since. Deputy Jenkins is a good lad, but barely 20 and thoroughly intimidated." Thomas broke a biscuit, buying time to consider his response. "And the Bradfords? They're still in the area?" "Camped at Twin Buttes, according to rumor. Close enough to cause trouble, far enough to avoid immediate consequences." Montgomery poured amber liquid into both glasses, sliding one toward Thomas. "They'll likely make their move when the mine payroll comes through on Tuesday's stage." It wasn't a question. Thomas looked up sharply. "You seem well informed yourself." Montgomery smiled thinly, raising his glass in a mock toast. "Professional necessity, Mr. Markham. A man in my line of work survives by reading both cards and situations with equal clarity." He sipped the bourbon appreciatively. "Which brings me to my curiosity about you." "Not much to tell," Thomas replied, ignoring the bourbon. The tremor in his hands would make drinking without spilling impossible anyway. "Just passing through." "A man just passing through typically avoids the sort of attention you attracted today." Montgomery's tone remained conversational, but his eyes had sharpened, "particularly a man with your distinctive condition." Thomas focused on his stew, which was surprisingly good. "Some situations can't be avoided." "True. Yet it wasn't the situation that intrigued me. It was your response to it." Montgomery set down his glass. "Your hands tremble, Mr. Markham, but your eyes don't. They're the eyes of a man accustomed to violence, a man who knows precisely how dangerous he is." The observation hung between them, too accurate to deny, too probing to acknowledge. Thomas continued eating in silence. Montgomery, undeterred, pressed on. "I've known gunslingers, lawmen and soldiers, Mr. Markham. Each carries violence differently. Some wear it like a flamboyant coat, others like a concealed knife. You," he said with quiet certainty, "wear it like a second skin. So familiar you've forgotten it's there." Thomas finally met the gambler's gaze. "What's your point?" "No point, merely observation." Montgomery cut a piece of venison with precise movements. "Though I confess, the contradiction fascinates me. A man with the bearing of a seasoned fighter, yet hands that shake like autumn leaves. An injury, perhaps, or something more complicated?" Before Thomas could respond, or more likely, deflect, the dining room door swung open with enough force to rattle the glasses on their table. Bert Porter and 2 of his companions from the earlier confrontation staggered in, already deep in. Their cups, Their bleary gazes swept the room before landing on Montgomery and Thomas. "Well, if it ain't the card sharp and his pet cripple," Porter announced loudly. "Thought I told you to clear out by sundown." Montgomery sighed with theatrical resignation. "And I interpreted that as a friendly suggestion rather than a mandate, Mr. Porter. An error in judgment, it seems." Thomas remained silent, his posture unchanged, save for a subtle shift that improved access to his concealed Remington. The tremor in his hands intensified, though his expression betrayed nothing. Porter advanced toward their table, his companions spreading out slightly in a maneuver that Thomas recognized as practiced intimidation. The few other diners hastily settled their bills and departed, familiar with the signs of impending trouble. "You cost me money today," Porter growled at Montgomery, "and made me look foolish in front of the whole town." His gaze shifted to Thomas. "With the help of this shaky wreck, you accomplished that entirely without assistance," Montgomery replied smoothly. "Now, might I suggest we all enjoy our respective meals in peace? The venison is really quite excellent." Porter's face darkened. His hand dropped to his holster, resting there meaningfully. "You got a smart mouth, gambler. Maybe I ought to rearrange it for you." Thomas cleared his throat. "Porter." The single word, delivered in that same unnervingly calm tone from their previous encounter, caught the larger man's attention. "Still here, shaky? Thought you'd have crawled back under whatever rock you came from." Porter's mocking grin faltered, slightly as he met Thomas's steady gaze. "Sit down," Thomas said quietly. "Have a drink, walk away. Those are your options." One of Porter's companions, the skinny man with the boot knife, laughed nervously. "Listen to him, boys, giving orders with them palsy hands." Porter, emboldened by his friend's mockery, took another step forward. "You threatening me, invalid? With what? You gonna shake me to death?" Thomas remained perfectly still, only his trembling hands betraying any reaction. "Last chance, Porter. Walk away." Montgomery watched the exchange with the analytical interest of a man studying a chess match, his hand casually slipping beneath his coat. Thomas noted the movement without turning his head. Clearly, the gambler wasn't as unarmed as he appeared. "Bert," the third man said suddenly, his voice tight with unexpected alarm. "Bert, I know him now. I recognize the eyes." Porter glanced at his companion impatiently. "What the hell are you talking about, Davis? I seen a poster a couple years back in Tucson," Davis continued, his face draining of color. "Man they called the Ghost, Manhunter. Killed 16 men they know of, had eyes just like that, dead eyes." Heavy silence fell across the room. Thomas betrayed nothing, but something cold and dangerous radiated from him now, impossible to miss. His trembling hands rested on the table, in plain sight, yet Porter's companions had begun backing toward the door. "You're drunk, Davis," Porter scoffed, but uncertainty had crept into his voice. "This here's just some saddle tramp with the shakes, probably dying of some wasting disease." "Could be," Thomas agreed softly, "or could be your friend's right. Either way, you've got a decision to make." Porter's gaze darted between Thomas's trembling hands and the unflinching coldness in his eyes. Whatever he saw there finally penetrated his alcohol-fogged judgment. His hand moved away from his holster. "Ain't worth the trouble," he muttered, echoing his earlier retreat. "Come on, boys. This place stinks anyway." Thomas and Montgomery sat in silence as the three men backed out of the dining room, their earlier bravado evaporated. Only when they disappeared into the gathering darkness did Montgomery speak. "Well," he said, refilling his bourbon glass with a steady hand, "that was illuminating." Thomas exhaled slowly, the coiled tension gradually ebbing from his frame. The tremor in his hands, however, had worsened to the point that he had to lower them to his lap. Davis was mistaken, he said flatly. "Of course," Montgomery agreed, not believing it for a moment. "Still, a fortunate mistake from our perspective." He sipped his bourbon, studying Thomas over the rim of his glass. though it does raise the intriguing question of who exactly I've had the pleasure of dining with this evening. Just a man trying to get through another day, Thomas answered, the weariness in his voice unmistakable. Montgomery nodded slowly, recognition flickering in his eyes, not of Thomas's identity, but of the burden that came with it. We all have our ghosts, Mr. Markham, some more literal than others. The perceptive comment hung between them as they finished their meal in a silence that had shifted from wary to something approaching companionable. By unspoken agreement, neither pursued the revelations the confrontation had provoked, though. Both men knew their brief acquaintance had fundamentally changed. As they departed the dining room, Montgomery paused in the hotel lobby. I generally find myself at the last drop most evenings, should you wish to continue our conversation. The poker games there are deplorable, but the information exchange is unparalleled. Thomas nodded acknowledgement, if not acceptance. Be careful. Montgomery, Porter strikes me as the type to hold a grudge. A hazard of my profession, the gambler replied with a slight smile, though perhaps less hazardous than yours, Mr. Markham. The deliberate pause before his name was Montgomery's, only acknowledgement of what they both now suspected. With a tip of his hat, the gambler departed, leaving Thomas alone with thoughts as turbulent as the trembling in his hands. Dawn broke over Copper Ridge in a blaze of amber and gold, painting the worn buildings with deceptive warmth. Thomas had been awake for hours, seated by his window as darkness gradually yielded to light. Sleep had proven elusive after the confrontation in the dining room, his mind cycling through the implications of Davis's recognition. If one man had identified him, others might follow. He flexed his fingers methodically, watching the tremors that had once been as foreign to him as fear. The morning ritual did little to steady his hands, but the familiar routine centered his thoughts. 3 years of running, of reinvention, of careful anonymity, all potentially undone by a chance encounter in a backwater town he'd never intended to visit. By 5:30, Thomas had made his decision. He would fulfill his commitment to Calloway for the day, then evaluate whether Copper Ridge had become too dangerous. The mayor's injury complicated matters, but he'd travelled on foot before when necessary. The livery stable was already bustling. When Thomas arrived, Ezekiel Calloway moved among the stalls with the quiet efficiency of a man who understood his charges, murmuring to the horses as he distributed feed. He acknowledged Thomas with a nod, apparently unsurprised by his early arrival. Your mare's doing better this morning, he reported, leading Thomas to where Sadie was contentedly munching hay. Swelling's down. Another day or two should set her right. Thomas ran a trembling hand along the mare's neck, receiving a gentle nudge in response. Good news. Calloway watched the exchange with knowing eyes. She trusts you. Horses sense things. People miss. He handed Thomas a pitchfork. Stalls need mucking, feed and water after. Then we've got a wagon wheel that needs rebuilding. The physical labor was welcome. Simple, demanding tasks that required focus without inviting conversation. Thomas lost himself in the rhythm of work, allowing muscle memory to compensate for his unsteady hands. By mid-morning, he'd settled into a productive routine that felt almost peaceful. That peace shattered when Billy Rawlins burst into the stable, his young face flushed with excitement. Mr. Markham, Mr. Calloway. The boy skidded to a halt, sending straw dust swirling in the sunbeams that streamed through the open door. They're saying all over town that Mr. Markham's famous, that he's really some deadly manhunter called the Ghost. Thomas froze, the curry brush motionless in his trembling grip. Calloway, repairing tack nearby, glanced up with newfound interest. That? So, the stableman asked mildly, though his eyes had sharpened. That's what everyone's saying, Billy continued breathlessly. That Davis recognized him from a wanted poster, and that's why Porter backed down last night. They say the Ghost killed more men than anyone can count. that he can draw faster than lightning, even though his hands shake like— Billy, Thomas interrupted, his voice quiet but firm. People say a lot of things. Doesn't make them true. The boy's enthusiasm dimmed slightly, but Davis was telling everyone at the general store that he's sure it's you. Said the ghost disappeared 3 years ago after some big shootout in Wyoming, and nobody knew if he was dead or alive. 3 years. Wyoming. The specificity sent a chill through Thomas. The events in Medicine Bow weren't common knowledge. The territorial government had worked hard to suppress the details, and Thomas had vanished immediately after. If Davis knew about Wyoming, he'd been more than a casual observer of wanted posters. Folks love a good story, Calloway observed, his weathered hands never pausing in their work, especially in quiet towns like this one. Makes them feel important, being close to something exciting. Billy looked between the two men, confused by their measured reactions to what he considered extraordinary news. But Mr. Markham, if you really are the ghost, you could help. You could stop the Bradford gang when they come for the payroll. The innocent suggestion landed like a physical blow. Thomas set down the curry brush carefully, conscious of Calloway's assessing gaze. Billy, he said gently, even if I was this person, which I'm not, that's not how the world works. One man doesn't stand against a gang like the Bradfords, no, matter who he might have been. But that's enough, Billy, Calloway interjected, his tone brooking no argument. Mr. Markham's right, and he's here to work, not entertain rumors. Don't you have deliveries for your ma? The boy's shoulders slumped in disappointment. Yes, sir. Sorry, Mr. Markham, I just thought— He trailed off, then straightened. Ma says to tell you the bread will be ready at noon if you want a fresh loaf. Tell her much obliged, Calloway replied. Now get along. After Billy departed, an uncomfortable silence settled over the stable. Thomas resumed grooming the bay gelding, hyper-aware of Calloway's contemplative scrutiny. Ghost, huh? The stableman finally said, testing the word like he might test the edge of a blade. Interesting name. It's nonsense, Thomas responded without looking up. Davis was drunk and looking to save face. Maybe so, Calloway conceded, returning to his repair work. Though it would explain a few things, Thomas paused. Like what? Like why a man with hands that tremble like yours carries himself like he knows exactly how dangerous he is. Calloway's observation echoed Montgomery's with unsettling precision. Don't misunderstand. It's no business of mine who you were before you walked into my stable. Just wondering if it might become my business, depending on how things play out. The implications hung heavily between them. Thomas resumed brushing the gelding, buying time to formulate a response that neither confirmed nor denied, yet addressed. Calloway's legitimate concerns. I came here for work and rest for my mare, he finally said, not looking for trouble. Trouble has a way of finding certain men regardless, Calloway replied evenly, especially when the Bradford gang's involved. Before Thomas could respond, a shadow darkened the stable entrance. Deputy Jenkins stood framed in the doorway, his badge gleaming incongruously on his barely adult chest. His posture projected an attempt at authority, undermined by the nervous adjustment of his gun belt. Mr. Markham. The deputy's voice cracked slightly. Sheriff Lawson would like to speak with you, if you've got a moment. Thomas and Calloway exchanged glances. The invitation, delivered by the deputy rather than issued as a direct summons, suggested the sheriff's condition limited his mobility. Sheriff's laid up at Doc Wilson's office, Jenkins added unnecessarily. Said it's important. I'm in the middle of work, Thomas replied, gesturing to the half-groomed horse. Go on, Calloway said, surprising him. Town's lawman asks for a word. Decent folk oblige. I'll finish up here. Trapped by the social obligation Calloway had invoked, Thomas reluctantly set aside the brush. I'll be back to help with that wagon wheel. It'll wait, Calloway assured him. though something in the stableman's expression suggested he was weighing the probability of Thomas's return. The walk to Doc Wilson's office with Deputy Jenkins proved illuminating, though not in the way the young lawman likely intended. The townspeople's reactions ranged from nervous greetings to hurried retreats indoors as Thomas passed. News of his potential identity had spread rapidly, transforming him overnight from curious invalid to feared gunman in the town's collective. "Imagination. Sheriff's been asking about you since first light," Jenkins volunteered as they turned onto a side street. "Davis came by at dawn, all fired up about recognizing you." "Davis is mistaken," Thomas said flatly. Jenkins glanced sideways at him, taking in the trembling hands and impassive face. "Yes, sir. That's what I told the sheriff too. Said there's no way a manhunter like the Ghost could have the shakes that— Bad, begging your pardon." The deputy's seemingly sympathetic dismissal was precisely the reaction Thomas had cultivated for 3 years, the assumption that his physical condition rendered him harmless. It had served as effective camouflage until now. Doc Wilson's office occupied a small whitewashed building near the church. The front room had been converted to a temporary bedroom where Sheriff Lawson lay propped up against several pillows, his face grey with pain beneath a week's growth of beard. Despite his obvious discomfort, intelligent eyes tracked Thomas's entrance with professional assessment. "That'll be all, Jenkins." Lawson dismissed the deputy with a small nod. "Close the door on your way out." When they were alone, the sheriff gestured to a wooden chair beside the bed. "Appreciate you coming, Mr. Markham. Or do you prefer another name these days?" Thomas remained standing. "Markham's fine." "Is it now?" Lawson shifted slightly, wincing at the movement. "Davis Holloway seems mighty convinced you're someone else entirely, someone with quite a reputation." "Davis Holloway is mistaken," Thomas repeated. "Maybe." Lawson studied him with the patient scrutiny of a man accustomed to separating truth from fiction. "Though I find it interesting that a man with your condition managed to back down Bert Porter without drawing a weapon. Porter's a bully, but he's not easily intimidated." Thomas said nothing, letting the silence stretch between them. "I've been lawman in Copper Ridge for 12 years, Lawson continued. "Seen all kinds come through, hard cases, grifters, men running to something, men running from something." His gaze remained steady on Thomas. "I'm guessing you're the latter." "Is there a point to this conversation, Sheriff?" Thomas asked quietly. Lawson gestured to his bandaged torso. "Bradford gang put this bullet in me 8 days ago. Doc says it's too close to my spine to remove safely. Means I can barely stand, let alone defend this town when they come for that payroll." Understanding dawned. "I'm not for hire, Sheriff." "Didn't say you were," Lawson countered. "Just laying out facts. Fact is, this town's sitting vulnerable. Fact is, the Bradfords know it. Another fact," he fixed Thomas with an unwavering stare, "is that a man with your reputation, if Davis is right, might be exactly what they're not expecting. Even if I was this person, which I'm not, those days are behind me," Thomas said, the familiar words feeling hollow as he spoke them. "Are they?" Lawson asked simply. "Because from where I'm lying, those days have a way of circling back around, whether we want them to or not. I can't help you, Sheriff." Thomas's words hung in the still air of the sick room. "Whatever Davis thinks he knows, whatever you're hoping for, I'm not that man anymore." Sheriff Lawson's weathered face revealed nothing, but his eyes reflected understanding rather than disappointment. "Fair enough. Can't blame a man for trying." He shifted slightly, wincing as the movement disturbed his wound. "Just thought I'd ask before good folks start dying." The implicit guilt landed precisely as intended. Thomas felt the familiar weight settling across his shoulders, the burden he'd carried away from Medicine Bow 3 years earlier, the weight that caused his hands to tremble with every waking moment. "The Bradfords have 12 men at last count," Lawson continued matter-of-factly. "Professional hard cases, not just saddle trash. 4 brothers at the core. Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezra, and Samuel. Isaiah's the brains, Jeremiah's the muscle, Ezra handles the planning, and Samuel, he paused, his expression darkening. Samuel's the true danger. Man kills for pleasure, not just necessity. You seem well informed for someone they shot, Thomas observed. Know your enemy, Lawson replied simply. Been tracking their movements for months. That's why I went out to Twin Buttes, had information. They were planning to set up permanent operations near Copper Ridge. The sheriff's mouth twisted in a grimace of pain, mingled with self-recrimination. Miscalculated. They were already dug in deeper than my source indicated. Thomas moved to the window, gazing out at the town, a collection of hopeful structures built by people seeking new beginnings in unforgiving territory. The same hope that had drawn him west after the war, before circumstances had transformed him into something he'd never intended to become. The stage with the payroll, he asked quietly. When exactly does it arrive? Tuesday. High noon. Lawson's voice remained neutral, betraying neither triumph nor relief at Thomas's implicit interest. 20,000 in gold and currency for the mine reopening. Words already leaked, which means the Bradfords know. And your deputy? The sheriff sighed. Jenkins is a good boy, eager, wants to do right. But he's greener than spring grass, and the town council wouldn't approve funds for additional deputies. He fixed Thomas with a steady gaze. The Bradfords will roll through this town like a prairie fire if nobody stands against them. Thomas turned from the window, his expression unreadable. I made a promise, Sheriff, 3 years ago in Wyoming. A promise to a dying woman that I'd never pick up a gun against another human being, that I'd find another way to live. Understanding dawned in Lawson's eyes. Medicine Bow, he said softly. The schoolteacher's wife. I heard rumors, but the territorial governor suppressed most details. Thomas's hands trembled more violently at the mention. Her name was Sarah Mitchell, caught in the crossfire when I cornered Frank Jessup in the schoolhouse. I'd tracked him for 3 weeks, a $1,000 bounty for murdering a judge in Colorado. His voice had gone flat, emotionless. She was helping her husband prepare for the new school term. Jessup grabbed her as a shield. I took the shot anyway. The confession hung in the air between them, the first time Thomas had spoken the truth. Aloud since leaving Wyoming. You hit Jessup, Lawson said. Not a question, but a statement of fact. Clean through the forehead. Dead before he hit the floor. Thomas's gaze had turned inward, seeing not the sick room, but the blood-spattered schoolhouse of his memory. But the bullet passed through, caught Sarah in the chest. She lived long enough to extract my promise. Lawson absorbed this revelation in silence, the pieces of the mysterious manhunter's disappearance finally falling into place. And the trembling? Started that day. Doctors in Denver called it nerve shock, said it might fade with time. Thomas flexed his unsteady fingers. 3 years later, still waiting, the sheriff nodded slowly. A heavy burden to carry, son. Not looking for sympathy? Thomas replied. Just explaining why I can't be what this town needs. Fair enough. Lawson settled back against his pillows, suddenly looking every year of his age, and then some. I respect a man who honors his promises. Just hope the Bradfords respect a town's right to exist after they're through with it. Thomas left Doc Wilson's office with the weight of the conversation pressing down on him like a physical force. The town seemed different now, not just a temporary way station, but a community of people oblivious to the approaching danger. Outside, the general store, a woman instructed her children to mind their manners as they selected penny candies. Near the telegraph office, 2 men argued amiably about cattle prices, while a third mended a harness in the shade. Ordinary lives that would be irrevocably altered if the Bradford gang swept through unchallenged. As Thomas turned toward the livery, stable, determined to complete his promised day's work, a familiar figure fell into step beside him. A productive conversation with our esteemed sheriff, I trust, Montgomery inquired, looking remarkably composed despite the early hour. The gambler had exchanged yesterday's trail-dusty attire for a fresh black suit, though he'd forgone his usual elaborate waistcoat in concession to the frontier setting. "Private," Thomas replied curtly. "Of course." Montgomery matched his stride effortlessly. "Though privacy is becoming something of a luxury for you, I fear. Your rumored identity is the sole topic of conversation in every establishment this morning." Thomas suppressed a grimace. "People will find something new to gossip about soon enough, perhaps." Montgomery extracted a silver case from his coat pocket, selected a thin cigar, and lit it with practiced movements. "Or perhaps the arrival of the Bradford gang will provide them with far more alarming subjects of discussion." Thomas stopped abruptly, fixing the gambler with a hard stare. "What do you know about the Bradfords?" "Reconnaissance?" Montgomery nodded, exhaling a thin stream of smoke. "Two of their associates visited the last drop yesterday evening. They posed as cattle buyers, but their questions focused primarily on the town's defenses, or lack thereof." His expression grew serious. "They were particularly interested in rumors of a famous gunman's presence." The implications settled like ice in Thomas's stomach. News of his possible identity had reached the Bradfords already, complicating an already precarious situation. "Did they believe it?" he asked quietly. "They seemed skeptical," Montgomery replied. One commented rather colorfully on the improbability of the ghost suffering from the shakes, as he put it. Thomas absorbed this information with outward calm, though his mind raced through the implications. The Bradford skepticism might prove advantageous. If they dismissed the rumors entirely, they might maintain their original plans without adapting to his potential presence. "You seem remarkably well informed for a traveling gambler," Thomas observed, resuming his walk toward the livery. Montgomery fell in step beside him once more. "Information is currency, Mr. Markham. I found it pays better dividends than cards on many occasions." He studied Thomas thoughtfully. "Though I confess, I'm curious about your interest in the Bradfords. Mere self-preservation or something more complex?" "Nothing complex about wanting to avoid a gang of killers," Thomas replied evenly. "Indeed." Montgomery didn't press further, though his expression suggested he understood more than Thomas had explicitly revealed. "Well, should you require any assistance in your avoidance efforts, I find myself at loose ends until the next stage arrives." Thomas glanced at him sharply. What kind of assistance could a gambler offer? "You might be surprised," Montgomery replied with a sphinx-like smile. "I wasn't always a dealer of cards, Mr. Markham, much as you weren't always a man with trembling hands." They had reached the livery stable, where Calloway was already at work on the wagon wheel. The stableman looked up as they approached, his gaze moving between Thomas and Montgomery with open curiosity. "Sheriff let you go, I see," he commented, returning to his task. "Figured he might try to deputize you, way things are shaping up." "Not interested in a badge," Thomas replied, removing his coat and hanging it on a nearby hook. The movement revealed his holstered Remington, which drew Calloway's attention. "Nice piece," the stableman observed. "Don't see many pearl-handled Remingtons out this way." Thomas made no response, rolling up his sleeves instead. Montgomery, sensing the shift in atmosphere, tipped his hat. "I'll leave you to your labors. Gentlemen, Mr. Markham, should you change your mind about our discussion, I'll be at the last drop this evening. A friendly game is planned, and the conversation promises to be illuminating." After the gambler's departure, Calloway handed Thomas a spoke shaver. "Wheel needs 8 new spokes. Oak blanks are over there." He nodded toward a neat stack of wood near the workbench. "Need steady hands for the tenons." The implied challenge hung between them. Thomas accepted the tool without comment, setting to work with deliberate focus. Though his hands trembled visibly, years of compensating for the condition had taught him to work through it, timing his movements to the rhythm of the tremors, applying pressure between the worst shakes. Calloway watched with undisguised interest as Thomas shaped the first, spoke with surprising precision despite his unsteady hands. After the third was completed to exact measurements, the stableman nodded with approval. "Adaptation," he said simply. "Mark of a survivor." Thomas looked up, meeting the older man's gaze directly for the first time. "Something like that, Sheriff. As for your help with the Bradfords?" He mentioned them. Thomas tested the fit of a tenon into the wheel hub, making minor adjustments with a small file. "Said they're coming for the payroll." Calloway grunted acknowledgement. "Town's been buzzing about it for days. Most folks are planning to shutter their businesses when the stage is due." "Smart," Thomas commented. "Maybe." Calloway set aside his tools and straightened, his expression grave. "Or maybe it just tells men like the Bradfords they can take whatever they want, whenever they want it, and decent folk will hide and hope they go away." The observation hit uncomfortably close to Thomas's own unspoken thoughts. He focused on shaping another spoke, buying time before responding. "One man can't stand against a gang like the Bradfords," he said finally, unconsciously echoing his earlier words to Billy. Calloway's weathered face revealed a lifetime of hard-earned wisdom. "Probably not," he agreed. "But sometimes a man has to try anyway, otherwise, what's the point of surviving?" The question lingered in the dusty air of the stable, unanswered but unignorable, a challenge that went beyond the immediate crisis. Of Copper Ridge to the heart of Thomas's existence these past 3 years. Dusk settled over Copper Ridge, painting the weathered buildings in hues of purple and gold. Thomas completed his day's work at the livery with the same focused precision that had characterized his past profession. The wagon wheel stood repaired, its new spokes fitted with remarkable craftsmanship despite his unsteady hands. "Good work," Calloway acknowledged, inspecting the finished product. "Didn't figure you for a woodworker." "Picked it up here and there," Thomas replied, cleaning tools and returning them to their proper places. The routine tasks helped settle his thoughts after the revelations of the day. Calloway leaned against a support post, studying him. "You given any more thought to what we discussed earlier?" "About the Bradfords?" Thomas rolled down his sleeves, buttoning them at the wrists. "Not much to think about. One man can't change what's coming." "Maybe." The stableman's weathered face revealed a lifetime of measured judgments. "Or maybe one man's all it takes sometimes, especially if he's the right man." Thomas retrieved his coat, feeling the familiar weight of the Remington in its holster. "I'm not the right man, Calloway. Not anymore, if you say so." Calloway straightened, reaching into his pocket. "Pay for the day's work. You earned it." He extended a silver $1.25. Thomas accepted the money with a nod of thanks. "I'll be back tomorrow to check on Sadie." "Stables open at dawn," Calloway replied, though something in his tone suggested he harbored doubts about Thomas's return. The evening air carried a welcome coolness as Thomas made his way through town. He had intended to return directly to the hotel, but Montgomery's invitation nagged at him. The gambler seemed unusually well informed about the Bradfords, and information might prove valuable regardless of Thomas's ultimate decision about staying in Copper Ridge. The Last Drop Saloon blazed with light and noise, a stark contrast to the quieting town around it. Through the windows, Thomas could see a packed house, miners, cowboys, and townspeople seeking escape from the growing tension that had settled over Copper Ridge. The bat-wing doors swung constantly as patrons entered and exited, their voices carrying in the still evening air. Thomas paused outside, instinctively scanning for threats before entering. Old habits died hard, especially when they'd kept you alive through years of hunting the most dangerous men in the territories. His eyes caught movement across the street, a figure watching the saloon from the shadows between buildings. The observer withdrew quickly, but not before Thomas glimpsed a distinctive red bandana. "The Bradford Scouts are still in town," he realized, filing away the information before pushing through the batwing doors. The interior of the last drop assaulted the senses. Tobacco smoke hung in thick clouds beneath the low ceiling. Piano music battled with raucous laughter for dominance, and the sharp tang of whiskey permeated everything. Thomas navigated through the crowd, his trembling hands drawing curious glances, but fewer than yesterday. The novelty of his condition had apparently been superseded by more pressing concerns. Montgomery occupied a corner table, dealing cards to 3 other players in what appeared to be a moderately high-stakes poker game. The gambler acknowledged Thomas with a slight nod, but continued his current hand without interruption. Thomas made his way to the bar, ordering coffee rather than whiskey. The bartender, a heavy-set man with impressive mustaches, raised an eyebrow at the unusual request, but served it without comment. From this vantage point, Thomas could observe both the room and Montgomery's game, while remaining inconspicuous. "Didn't figure you for a coffee man?" a voice remarked beside him. Thomas turned to find Deputy Jenkins leaning against the bar, looking uncomfortable in his formal capacity among the revelry. "Steadies the nerves," Thomas replied, though both knew the tremor in his hands would remain unaffected. Jenkins nodded as if this made perfect sense. "Sheriff wanted me to thank you for stopping by this morning." He hesitated, then lowered his voice. "Also wanted me to let you know that we got word the Bradford brothers themselves rode into Twin Buttes about an hour ago. All 4 of them." The TASS news confirmed Thomas's suspicions. The entire gang was assembling for the payroll robbery. "Appreciate the information," Thomas said quietly, "though I'm not sure why the sheriff thinks it concerns me." Jenkins flushed slightly. "He just thought you should know is all." The deputy fidgeted with his badge. "For what it's worth, I've been asking around about you, about the ghost." Thomas tensed imperceptibly. "And? Stories don't match up," Jenkins admitted. "Some say he was a former cavalry scout gone bad. Others claim he was a lawman who lost his family and went on a vengeance hunt. One old-timer in Denver told me the ghost was actually a Pinkerton who went independent after the war. People love their legends," Thomas commented neutrally. "Thing is," Jenkins continued undeterred, "only parts everyone agrees on are that he was the fastest draw in the territories, never missed a shot, and disappeared completely after Medicine Bow." Thomas sipped his coffee, using the mundane action to mask his discomfort at the deputy's surprising knowledge. "Sounds more like a campfire tale than a real person." "Maybe so." Jenkins straightened, adjusting his gun belt with youthful self-consciousness. "But if even half the stories are true, a man like that could make a difference when the Bradfords hit town." He tipped his hat respectfully. "Evening, Mr. Markham." As the deputy made his way through the crowd, continuing his patrol, Thomas noticed that Montgomery's poker game had concluded. The gambler was collecting his winnings with practiced efficiency as his opponents departed, their expressions ranging from rueful to resentful. Thomas carried his coffee to the recently vacated table, settling into a chair opposite Montgomery, without invitation. "Profitable evening?" "Moderately so," Montgomery replied, arranging coins and bills into neat stacks. "Though one might argue that the true value lies in the conversation rather than the currency." He gestured to Thomas's trembling hands. "Coffee rarely helps with nerve conditions, in my experience." "Wasn't expecting it to," Thomas replied. "Just preferred to keep a clear head." Montgomery nodded approvingly. "A wise precaution considering our guests." "Guests?" The gambler inclined his head slightly toward a table near the back of the room. The gentleman in the buckskin jacket with the red bandana, Samuel Bradford, youngest of the brothers, and by all accounts, the most volatile. His voice remained conversational, betraying no hint of the significance of this information. "He's been here for the past hour, nursing a single whiskey and watching the door." Thomas resisted the urge to turn and look directly. Instead, he adjusted his position, subtly, using the cloudy mirror behind the bar to locate the man Montgomery had identified. Samuel Bradford appeared younger than Thomas had expected, perhaps 25, with a boyish face that contrasted sharply with the cold calculation in his eyes. The red bandana confirmed he was the observer Thomas had spotted across the street earlier. "Alone?" Thomas asked quietly. "For now," Montgomery confirmed, "though I suspect his visit has a purpose beyond refreshment." As if summoned by their conversation, Samuel Bradford rose from his table and approached. His movements possessed the fluid grace of a natural predator, unhampered by the pistols holstered at each hip. He stopped beside their table, lips curved in a smile that never reached his eyes. "Evening, gentlemen," he drawled, his voice surprisingly cultured for a notorious outlaw. "Mind if I join you?" Without waiting for an answer, he pulled out a chair and sat, placing his half-empty whiskey glass on the table. His gaze settled on Thomas with undisguised curiosity. "Samuel Bradford," he introduced himself, extending a hand. "Though I suspect Mr. Montgomery here has already mentioned that fact." Thomas regarded the offered hand, but made no move to take it. "Markham," he said simply. Bradford withdrew his hand, seemingly amused rather than offended. "Thomas Markham. At least that's the name you're using in Copper Ridge." His eyes flicked to Thomas's trembling hands. "Some folks seem to think you might be someone altogether more interesting." "People talk," Thomas replied neutrally. "That they do." Bradford leaned back, studying Thomas with the detached interest of a scientist examining a specimen, especially about a man called the Ghost. Quite the reputation, 30 men dead by his hand, if the stories can be believed. A manhunter who never failed to bring in his quarry, dead or alive. Montgomery shuffled his deck of cards idly, his attention apparently focused on this mundane task, rather than the charged conversation. Yet Thomas noticed how the gambler had positioned himself with clear access to whatever weapon he concealed. "Beneath his coat. Sounds like fiction to me," Thomas commented, taking a deliberate sip of his coffee, despite the pronounced tremor in his hands. "Most likely," Bradford agreed with exaggerated amiability. "After all, the Ghost was said to have the steadiest hands in the West. A man who could put 6 bullets through the same hole at 50 paces. His gaze lingered meaningfully on Thomas's trembling fingers. "You, Mr. Markham, seem to suffer from the opposite condition." Thomas met Bradford's stare evenly. "Disappointing for those hoping for a legend, I imagine." "Indeed." Bradford signaled to the bartender for another whiskey. "My brothers and I were quite concerned when we heard rumors that the famous Ghost might be in Copper Ridge. I volunteered to assess the situation personally." His smile widened, revealing teeth as white and sharp as a young wolf's. "I'm pleased to report that our concerns appear unfounded." The implication hung in the air between them. The Bradfords had identified what they believed to be Thomas's deception and dismissed him as a threat. Exactly the outcome he should have wanted, given his vow in Medicine Bow. Yet something in Bradford's smug dismissal stirred embers Thomas had thought long extinguished. "Glad to set your mind at ease," Thomas replied evenly. Bradford accepted. A fresh whiskey from a passing barmaid, tossing a coin carelessly onto her tray. "We have business in town soon. Wouldn't want complications." The threat beneath his cordial tone was unmistakable, especially from a man who can barely hold a coffee cup without spilling. Montgomery chose this moment to intervene, spreading his cards in a perfect fan across the table. "Perhaps a friendly game, gentlemen? To pass the evening in civilized company?" Bradford's eyes narrowed at the interruption. "Another time, perhaps. I have matters to attend to." He rose smoothly, whiskey in hand. "A pleasure making your acquaintance, Mr. Markham. I'll be sure to tell my brothers they have nothing to fear from the trembling ghost of Copper Ridge." Bradford sauntered away. Thomas and Montgomery exchanged a glance, laden with unspoken understanding. The encounter had clarified the situation considerably. The Bradfords knew of Thomas's rumored identity, but had dismissed the threat based on his physical condition. They would proceed with their planned robbery unaltered, confident that the town's defenses remained inadequate. "Well," Montgomery observed quietly, gathering his cards. "That was informative." Thomas nodded slightly, watching Bradford's departure through the batwing doors. "He's going to report to his brothers that I'm no threat." "Precisely as you might have hoped," Montgomery pointed out. "Your secret remains effectively intact, and the Bradfords will proceed without taking special precautions against you." Yet something in Thomas's expression must have shifted, for Montgomery studied him with renewed interest. "Unless, of course, you find yourself reconsidering your position of non-involvement." Thomas didn't respond immediately. The encounter with Samuel Bradford had affected him more than he cared to admit. The outlaw's casual dismissal, his absolute confidence in his own impunity, reminded Thomas too sharply of other men he had once hunted, men who believed themselves beyond justice until the moment it found them. "I made a promise," Thomas said. Finally, his voice barely audible above the saloon's din. Montgomery nodded solemnly. "As have we all at one time or another. The question becomes, which promises define us and which ones chain us?" He began stacking his winnings methodically. "Sometimes the truest loyalty to our past commitments lies in knowing when they must evolve." Thomas rose from the table, his decision not yet fully formed, but taking shape with increasing clarity. "I need to think, of course." Montgomery didn't look up from his task, though I suspect time for contemplation grows short. "The stage arrives at noon tomorrow, and with it a moment of reckoning for Copper Ridge, and for you, Mr. Markham." Sleep eluded Thomas as he sat by the window of his hotel room, his troubled gaze fixed on the darkened street below. Copper Ridge had settled into an uneasy quiet, broken occasionally by raised voices from the last drop or the distant howl of a coyote in the surrounding hills. The encounter with Samuel Bradford had left him restless, stirring memories and instincts he'd fought to suppress for 3 years. From his pocket, Thomas withdrew the folded letter, the one possession he'd carried faithfully through every mile of his self-imposed exile. The paper had grown thin at the creases, threatening to tear with each handling, yet he opened it with the reverence of a priest unfolding sacred text. Though he knew the contents by heart, he read the words again in the faint moonlight streaming. "Through the window, Mr. Reed. By the time you read this, I will have joined my husband in whatever awaits us beyond this life. The doctors say the wound is mortal, though they've tried to spare me this knowledge. I want you to understand that I do not blame you for what happened. Frank Jessup made his choices, as did you, as did I when I chose to help prepare the schoolhouse. Despite warnings of danger, we are each accountable for our own actions in this life. Yet I have witnessed the toll that violence takes, not just on its victims, but on those who deal in it. I see it in your eyes. A man who has walked so long in darkness that he's forgotten there might be another path. So I ask this of you, not as penance, but as the last request of a dying woman. Lay down your guns. Find another way to live. The cycle of death you've been caught in leads nowhere but to more graves. Those of your targets, eventual bystanders like myself, and ultimately, your own. There is more to life than this endless pursuit of justice through the barrel of a gun. Find it before it's too late for you, as it is now for me. With hope for your future, Sarah Mitchell Thomas carefully refolded the letter and returned it to his pocket. For 3 years, he had honored Sarah Mitchell's dying request. He had wandered from town to town, taking odd jobs, avoiding confrontation, allowing his once legendary reputation to fade into rumor and myth. The trembling in his hands Whether from nerve damage sustained during the war, the psychological impact of Medicine Bow, or some combination of factors the doctors couldn't fully explain, had become both burden and blessing, a constant reminder of his vow and an effective disguise against recognition. Yet now, faced with the imminent threat to Copper Ridge, that vow felt less like redemption and more like cowardice. Samuel Bradford's dismissive assessment echoed in his mind, along with Sheriff Lawson's quiet acceptance of his refusal to help, Calloway's philosophical challenge, and Montgomery's pointed observation about which promises define us and which chain us. A sharp rap at his door interrupted these troubled reflections. Thomas moved silently to one side, hand instinctively reaching for the Remington before he consciously registered the familiar pattern of the knock. "Montgomery," he called softly. "I know it's you." The door opened to reveal the gambler, his expression unusually grave. "We have a situation," he said without preamble. "May I enter?" Thomas stepped aside, noting that Montgomery had exchanged his usual formal attire for darker, more practical clothing. The gambler moved to the center of the room, keeping his voice low. Deputy Jenkins was just found unconscious behind the last drop. He'd been patrolling the back streets when someone ambushed him. Alarm coursed through Thomas. Bradford, possibly, though the method seems crude for his usual work. Jenkins was struck from behind, alive but concussed. Montgomery's expression tightened. "More concerning is what else I've discovered. The Bradfords have moved up their timetable." Thomas tensed. "The stage isn't due until noon tomorrow." "Precisely. But reliable sources indicate they plan to hit the bank tonight instead." Montgomery glanced toward the window. "The mine owner deposited advance funds yesterday to prepare for the payroll distribution. Not as substantial as what's coming on the stage, but significant enough to tempt them, especially with the sheriff incapacitated and the deputy now indisposed." "How reliable is this information?" Thomas asked, though he already suspected the answer. Montgomery's intelligence had proven accurate thus far. "I cultivate relationships with barmaids at establishments frequented by outlaws," Montgomery replied, with a thin smile. "Amazing what men reveal after sufficient whiskey. Samuel Bradford's companion was quite forthcoming once Samuel departed." Thomas moved to the window, scanning the street below with newfound urgency. The bank stood 3 buildings down from the hotel, a modest structure with barred windows and a heavy oak door. No unusual movement caught his eye, but the deepest part of night still lay ahead, the hours before dawn, when the town would sleep most soundly. "Why tell me?" he asked, turning back to Montgomery. "I've made my position clear." Montgomery studied him thoughtfully. "Have you?" "Because the man I observed today, the man who tracked Samuel Bradford's movements throughout the saloon while pretending indifference, who assessed threats and exits with professional precision, that man seemed less resolved than he claims." The gambler's perception was uncomfortably accurate. Thomas felt the familiar weight of the Remington at his hip, a presence both reassuring and condemning. "I made a promise," he said, the words sounding hollow even to his own ears. "To a dying woman," Montgomery acknowledged, surprising Thomas. "I know more about you than you might think, Mr. Markham. Or should I say, Thomas Reed, your reputation preceded you even before Medicine Bow. The question now is whether honoring one promise requires breaking another. The implicit promise every man of conscience makes to stand against cruelty and injustice when confronted with it." Thomas regarded the gambler with new wariness. "You seem unusually invested for a traveling card player." Montgomery's expression shifted subtly, revealing glimpses of another identity beneath the carefully maintained facade. "Let's just say I understand the burden of obligations that conflict." He moved toward the door, pausing with his hand on the knob. "I'm merely providing information, Mr. Reed. What you do with it is entirely your decision. But know this, the Bradfords intend to rob that bank before dawn, and they won't leave witnesses." After Montgomery's departure, Thomas returned to the Higo window, his attention now fixed on the bank with heightened vigilance. The tremor in his hands had intensified, as it always did during moments of heightened emotion or decision. He flexed his fingers, performing the exercises a doctor in Denver had recommended years ago, though they'd never proven effective. The town lay vulnerable, its primary protector wounded and its deputy incapacitated. If Montgomery's information proved accurate, the Bradford gang would strike within hours, likely leaving death in their wake. The bank manager and his family lived in rooms above the establishment. They would be the first victims if the robbery turned violent, as it almost certainly would, with Samuel Bradford involved. Thomas removed the Remington from its holster, testing its weight and balance. Despite 3 years of disuse in actual combat, he had maintained the weapon meticulously, cleaning and oiling it with the same precision that had once made him legendary. The pearl grips caught the moonlight as he checked the cylinder. 6 rounds, as always. He had 12 more in his coat pocket, a habit he'd never abandoned, despite his vow. The trembling in his hands made the simple act of checking his weapon a challenge, yet muscle memory compensated for the physical limitation. Thomas had adapted to his condition over time, learning to work with it rather than against it. Still, he hadn't fired the Remington at a human target since Medicine Bow. Could he even hit what he aimed at anymore? The uncertainty added another layer to his moral dilemma. He reached into his pocket and withdrew Sarah Mitchell's letter once more, reading the key passage that had guided his existence these past 3 years. So I ask this of you, not as penance, but as the last request of a dying woman, lay down your guns. Find another way to live. Thomas folded the letter and returned it to his pocket, his decision crystallizing with sudden clarity. He would honor Sarah's request, but perhaps the true meaning of her words had eluded him all this time. She had asked him to find another way to live, not to stand idle while innocent people died. The path forward wasn't abandoning his skills, but redirecting them, using them to protect rather than to hunt. With renewed purpose, Thomas holstered the Remington and retrieved his duster from the hook near the door. The night had turned cool, the stars sharp and clear in the moonless sky as he stepped onto the hotel's porch. Copper Ridge slumbered unaware of the danger approaching. Shopkeepers, families, and ordinary folk who deserved better than to be, victimized by predators like the Bradfords. As Thomas moved silently toward the bank, he spotted a familiar figure emerging from the shadows of the general store. Calloway, shotgun cradled in his arms. "Figured you might show up," the stableman commented quietly as Thomas approached. "Montgomery stopped by the livery." "You should be home," Thomas replied, though without conviction. Something about the older man's presence felt right, as if pieces of a complex puzzle were falling into place. Calloway shrugged. "Got no family to worry about. Figure I can risk my neck if I want to." He nodded toward the bank. "No sign of trouble yet, but I've been watching for about an hour. Something's coming. Can feel it in my bones." Thomas scanned the darkened buildings surrounding the bank, identifying potential positions from which the Bradfords might approach. "How well do you know the bank layout?" "Well enough. Worked there briefly before the livery." Calloway shifted his shotgun to a more comfortable position. "Manager's family, wife and 2 children, sleep in the apartment upstairs. Entrance is through the back, separate from the bank proper." "They need to be evacuated," Thomas decided, quietly, without alerting any watchers. The task would require stealth and persuasion, skills Thomas had honed during his years as a manhunter, but hadn't abandoned during his self-imposed retirement. As he formulated a plan, calculating risks and contingencies with practiced efficiency, he felt a strange sense of rightness, as if the past 3 years had been merely preparation for this moment of decision. The trembling in his hands remained, pronounced, but something had shifted within him. What had been a burden now felt like a reminder of humanity rather than weakness, a physical manifestation of the conscience Sarah Mitchell had recognized in him even as she lay dying. "Family's quarters have a back entrance," Calloway whispered, indicating a narrow staircase attached to the building's rear. "Jasper Mills, the bank manager, keeps a shotgun by his bed. Man's no gunfighter, but he'll defend his family." Thomas nodded, calculating risks. "We need him aware but calm. A panicked man with a shotgun is a danger to everyone." They ascended the stairs without a sound, years of frontier experience guiding their movements. Thomas's senses, honed by years, of tracking the most dangerous men across unforgiving terrain, registered details most would miss, the faint impressions of boot prints in the dust near the door, still fresh, the barely discernible scent of tobacco different from the local blend, the absence of night creatures that should have been active in the alley below. "We're being watched," he murmured to Calloway. At least one man on the roof across the street. Calloway's weathered features betrayed no surprise, only grim confirmation. "How do you want to play this? Get the family out through the bank. I'll create a distraction if needed." Thomas's trembling fingers tested the door, finding it locked as expected. He withdrew a thin metal tool from his coat pocket, another remnant of his former profession, and worked the simple lock with surprising dexterity despite his unsteady hands. The door yielded silently to his practiced touch. Thomas entered first, Calloway close behind, both men moving with the careful precision of hunters in dangerous territory. The family quarters were modest but comfortable, a small sitting room opening to a kitchen on one side and a hallway leading to bedrooms on the other. A floorboard creaked beneath Calloway's weight. Instantly, a door down the hallway opened, revealing Jasper Mills in nightclothes, shotgun leveled at the intruders. "Don't move," Mills hissed, his voice taut with fear but controlled. "I'll blow you both apart." Thomas raised his trembling hands, slowly, palms forward. "Mr. Mills, we're not here to harm you. The Bradford gang is planning to rob your bank tonight. We need to get your family to safety." Mills didn't lower the shotgun, his gaze flicking between Thomas's face and his shaking hands. "You're that fella with the tremors, the one they're saying might be the ghost." Suspicion warred with desperate hope in his expression. "How do I know this isn't some trick?" "Because we came to your family first, instead of waiting downstairs for the Bradfords," Calloway answered pragmatically. "Now lower that scattergun before you wake your children with a noise that'll bring those outlaws running." The simple logic penetrated Mills's fear. He lowered the weapon slightly, indecision still evident in his stance. "My wife and children need to be evacuated quietly," Thomas finished for him. "Is there a way through the bank to the street, preferably not visible from the front windows?" Mills nodded slowly. "Storage room connects to the back office. There's a door that opens to the side street." "Good. Wake your family. No lamps. Take only what you can carry in one trip." Thomas's voice carried the quiet authority that had once commanded respect throughout the territories. "Calloway will escort you to the sheriff's office. It's the most defensible building in town." "And you?" Calloway asked, though his tone suggested he already knew the answer. Thomas's expression hardened. "I'll make sure the Bradfords find what they're looking for." Understanding passed between the two men, a silent acknowledgement of the risk Thomas was undertaking. Calloway clasped his shoulder briefly before turning to help Mills gather his family. Within minutes, the bank manager had roused his wife and two young children. The small group followed Thomas's instructions with commendable discipline, moving through the darkened building toward the side exit. Thomas remained in the family quarters, watching through a window that overlooked the main street. Movement caught his eye, shadows detaching from deeper shadows across from the bank. He counted 4 figures approaching the front entrance, plus at least two more taking positions at strategic points along the street. The Bradford brothers had brought their full contingent for this operation. Thomas descended to the bank proper via the interior stairs, positioning himself behind the teller counter. The main floor lay in darkness, moonlight filtering through, barred windows to cast striped shadows across polished wood and brass fixtures. He drew the Remington, its familiar weight both comforting and burdensome. The tremor in his hands intensified as memories of Medicine Bow threatened to surface, but he pushed them aside, focusing instead on the immediate threat. He didn't have to wait long. Metal scraped against metal as someone worked the lock of the bank's front door, a skilled touch that spoke of experience rather than desperate force. The heavy door swung open silently, and four figures slipped inside, moving with the confident precision of men who had rehearsed this operation multiple times. Thomas recognized Samuel Bradford instantly, the red bandana visible even in the dim light. The others would be his brothers, Isaiah, the eldest and leader, Jeremiah, built like a blacksmith's anvil, and Ezra, whose wire-rimmed spectacles gleamed faintly as he moved toward the vault. "Hurry up, Ezra," Samuel's voice carried in the quiet. "Bank, I don't like this. Town's too quiet." "Relax, little brother," came the calm reply as Ezra knelt before the vault, extracting tools from a leather case. "Simple pin tumbler lock. 2 minutes tops." "Should have hit the stage tomorrow instead," grumbled Jeremiah, his massive form looming near the door. "Cleaner job in daylight." "And face the ghost?" Samuel laughed softly. "No, thank you. I met him. Remember, just some trembling wreck who can barely hold a coffee cup. Then why change our plans?" Ezra asked, his fingers working delicately at the vault mechanism. "Insurance," replied Isaiah, speaking for the first time. His voice carried the cool authority of unquestioned leadership. "Better to take what we can now than risk complications tomorrow. If the ghost proves more dangerous than Samuel believes, we'll be long gone with tonight's haul." Thomas calculated his options. The Bradfords were positioned throughout the bank, making it impossible to target all four simultaneously. In his prime, with steady hands, he might have attempted it. Now, with his tremor and 3 years of disuse, such an effort would be suicide. Instead, he waited, letting them proceed with their robbery. The vault door swung open with a satisfied grunt from Ezra. Samuel and Isaiah entered while Jeremiah maintained his watch at the door. 20,000, Samuel announced with evident delight. "Looks like our information was good after all." Thomas rose silently from behind the counter, the Remington steady despite his trembling hands. "Evening, gentlemen. I believe you're making a withdrawal without proper authorization." The reaction was instantaneous. Jeremiah whirled toward the sound, his hand dropping to his holster. Samuel and Isaiah emerged from the vault, weapons already drawn. Only Ezra remained motionless, his lock-picking tools still in hand. "Well, well," Samuel's voice dripped with mocking amusement. "The trembling ghost himself, come to stop us with those shaky hands." Thomas ignored the taunt, his focus absolute. "You have two choices. Surrender your weapons and face territorial justice, or draw against me. Either way, you're not leaving with that money." Isaiah stepped forward, his calculating gaze assessing Thomas with clinical precision. 4 against 1. Poor odds, even for a legend. 3, Thomas corrected quietly. "Your brother Jeremiah is already dead. He just doesn't know it yet." The confidence in his tone gave even Samuel pause. Uncertainty flickered across the youngest Bradford's face as he glanced toward his massive brother still covering the door. "He's bluffing," Jeremiah growled, though his voice carried a new edge of doubt. "Look at his hands shaking. Man couldn't hit the broad side of a barn." "Perhaps," Thomas acknowledged, the Remington unwavering despite his trembling fingers. "Or perhaps the tremor is what helps me now. creates an unpredictability in the shot pattern. Makes it impossible for even me to know exactly where the bullet will land. A ghostly smile touched his lips. Shall we test the theory? A heavy silence fell over the bank as the standoff stretched into seconds that felt like hours. The Bradford brothers exchanged glances, some unspoken communication passing between them. Thomas recognized the silent calculation. They were deciding whether to attack simultaneously or attempt to negotiate. Samuel made the decision for them. With the reckless confidence of youth and bloodlust, he moved first, raising his pistol. With practiced speed, what happened next would later grow into legend throughout the territories. Despite his trembling hands, or perhaps because of them, Thomas fired with a speed that defied human perception. The Remington barked once, twice, 3 times in such rapid succession that the reports blended into a continuous roar. Samuel Bradford collapsed without firing a shot, a neat hole centered in his forehead. Jeremiah fell next, clutching his chest. In disbelief, Isaiah managed to discharge his weapon, the bullet splintering the counter beside Thomas before a return shot silenced him permanently. Only Ezra remained, his hands raised in immediate surrender, lockpicks clattering to the floor. "Don't shoot," he pleaded, glasses askew on his pale face. "Please." Thomas kept the Remington trained on the surviving Bradford, his hands still trembling, but his aim unerring. Wise decision. The bank door burst open, revealing Deputy Jenkins with a shotgun, followed closely by Calloway and Montgomery. They surveyed the scene with expressions ranging from shock to grim satisfaction. "My God," Jenkins breathed, taking in the 3 fallen, Outlaws, and the trembling but victorious figure of Thomas Markham. "It's true, then. You really are the ghost." Thomas holstered the Remington with practiced ease, despite his unsteady hands. "Not anymore. Just a man who made a choice." Later, as dawn painted the eastern sky with ribbons of gold and crimson, Thomas stood on the hotel porch with Montgomery and Calloway. The town was awakening to news of the thwarted robbery and the demise of 3 of the 4 Bradford brothers. Already the story was growing in the telling, how the legendary ghost had returned from retirement to save Copper Ridge, how his trembling hands had proven not a weakness, but an advantage that confused and terrified his opponents. "What will you do now?" Montgomery asked, lighting one of his thin cigars with practiced elegance. "Your secret is thoroughly exposed. Every bounty hunter and glory seeker in the territories will come looking for the ghost once word spreads." Thomas flexed his trembling fingers thoughtfully. "Thomas Reed died 3 years ago in Medicine Bow. Thomas Markham is just a man with shaky hands who happened to be in the right place at the right time." "The law might see it differently," Calloway observed. "There are still those old warrants, from your hunting days." "Actually," Montgomery interjected, "Sheriff Lawson received a telegraph this morning from the territorial governor. Seems all outstanding warrants against one Thomas Reed have been officially rescinded in recognition of services rendered to the territory." He smiled slightly at Thomas's surprised expression. "I may have sent a wire last night explaining the situation. Awful convenient timing," Calloway remarked dryly, though his eyes twinkled with knowing approval. Thomas gazed toward the livery stable, where Sadie waited in her stall, her injured leg healing well according to Calloway's assessment. For 3 years, he had wandered without purpose, believing that honoring his vow to Sarah Mitchell meant abandoning the skills that defined him. Now he understood that her true gift had been showing him how those same skills could protect rather than merely punish. "I think I'll stay," he said finally, "at least for a while. Sheriff Lawson mentioned needing a deputy with experience once he's back on his feet." Montgomery nodded approvingly. "The trembling lawman of Copper Ridge has a certain poetic quality, doesn't it?" As the town stirred to life around them, Thomas felt a peculiar sense of peace settling over him. His hands would likely tremble for the rest of his days, a physical reminder of promises made and lessons learned. Yet for the first time since Medicine Bow, he saw this not as punishment, but as transformation. The ghost was gone, his legend fading into frontier myth. Thomas Markham remained, a man whose seemingly steady aim came not despite his trembling hands, but through them, a living testament to the lightning that can still be found in the most unexpected places. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.